In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet stating that the freedoms of men can only be maintained by limiting the power of government. The pamphlet was called Common Sense, and today it still is common sense.
I'm Mark Zaccaria.
I'm April G. Rousseau. This is Common Sense. Welcome back. If you've tuned us in this week to hear a little good news, for a change, about the integrity and efficiency of the Ocean State's bureaucracy, you're in luck. We actually have something for you on that very theme. On the other hand, if you're depressed by the condition of what our state's electorate accepts as leadership, we have an in-depth research that will prove to you that you're depressed with good reason. Looking ahead to the referenda you'll see on November's ballot, we will have some guidance on what's important coming right up. In this edition of Common Sense, Mark will interview John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause, the state's most prominent good government NGO. Pay careful attention to count how many times Mark refers to that organization as Common Sense, or even Common Core. There will be a quiz following the broadcast. In between segments of that review of their current and future priorities, Mark and I will drop back in to pose our favorite satiric question, are you kidding me? Finally, commentator Jeff Richard will close out the proceedings with his essay on the uptick of our seniors rocking the ganja. So let's get things rolling with some analysis of the news that most affects Rhode Islanders this week. Mark?
Thanks, April. Last year, Common Sense reported on the sudden departure of the director of the state's Division of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF. Janice DeFrancis left under a cloud of investigation and invective. The incoming governor refused to reappoint her as charges of financial mismanagement and worse swirled around the embattled executive. It seemed that DCYF had hit a low point back in January of 2015, especially because the governor had no one else in mind to take over but just wanted Ms. DeFrancis gone. The new acting director was Jamia McDonald. At the time of her appointment, Ms. McDonald held the post of communications manager for the division. Essentially, she was its press agent, a role for which no credentials in social work were required. Jamia McDonald did have a background in business management, however. When viewed through that lens, the troubled agency seemed rife with problems that its new director was very well qualified to tackle. Acting Director McDonald immediately instituted a standardized purchasing procedure which eliminated the appearance of no-bid contracts and guaranteed the qualifications of all vendors. She also reviewed the organization chart for the unit to make the lines of responsibility and authority simple and directly related to the tasks for which each branch was responsible. These two steps went far towards reinvigorating the morale of line workers within the division, which had been in the cellar at the outset of her term. Doubtless there were many more little things that made life better on a day-to-day basis under Ms. McDonald. The bottom line is that her term as acting director proved that even a Rhode Island bureaucracy could be operated efficiently and with the best outcomes for its clients as its goal. Last week, Jamia McDonald submitted her letter of resignation to Governor Raimondo. She now plans to return to the private sector. DCYF regulations have long stipulated that the director must have formal credentials in social work. The governor hinted broadly that a legislative change to that requirement might be possible to enable McDonald to be appointed permanently to that post. Having shown what can be done to make a government agency efficient, though, the acting director decided to take her leave, hoping the management template would be maintained by the social services expert who will follow her. We here at Common Sense hope so too. Good show, Jamia McDonald. April?
Good show indeed, Mark. You're familiar with the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank here in the Ocean State, and it is dedicated to providing empirical research on the breadth and depth of individual freedom here in our state. The center focuses on both free market solutions to problems and the general levels of freedom from government regulation or intervention among citizens. It's also associated with a nationwide group of similar freedom research teams, the State Policy Network. Each year, the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity tabulates all the votes taken in our General Assembly on bills directly relating to local freedoms. From this research, the Center compiles a scorecard of state legislators which ranks them from most oriented towards freedom to least oriented towards freedom. The scale goes from positive numbers indicating pro-freedom voting to negative numbers indicating an anti-freedom bias. This year's scorecard was just released. It can be found on the center's website, rifreedom.org. The highest, or most pro-freedom score achieved in the General Assembly this year was the plus 27.8. That score was put up by West Warwick Rep and Common Sense contributor Patricia Morgan. The lowest score recorded was minus 73.1. That distinction belongs to Senator William Conley, Jr. of East Providence and Pawtucket. In fact, only 11 lawmakers scored in positive territory on this year's Freedom Index. That left 102 demonstrating a bias against individual freedoms. So what do you think that it means when, as a state electorate, we hire legislative representatives who are more than 9/10 opposed to allowing us to have the final say over how our lives are conducted? It's tempting to conclude that, collectively, we like it that way. I'm sure Senator Conley will be pushing that thesis as he campaigns this year. Sadly, I think the problem is even more subtle than that. I don't think very many of us pay any attention at all to personal freedom as a metric of quality of life. So, of course, we don't use it as a good measure to determine good representation, either before or after we vote. I trust that blanket indictment does not apply to regular viewers of Common Sense. As for the viewers of Dancing with the Stars, though, I am concerned. Ronald Reagan famously cautioned that we are never more than one generation away from the total loss of American liberties. Vladimir Lenin infamously put that same idea another way. He said that when America falls to socialism, not a single shot will be fired, nor will even one communist soldier be wounded. So the Freedom Index, here in Rhode Island, is not so much a tool for political campaigning. What it actually might be is a lab report from the annual physical exam of our state as a patient ailing with a gross lack of interest in its own well-being. If that's what it is, then the ominous nature of its message goes way beyond who's number 1 or who's number 113. Mark?
Thanks again, April, I think. There are a number of referenda on November's ballot. Rhode Islanders will be asked to pass on whether or not casino gambling should be allowed in Tiverton. That's question 1. We will be asked to approve a bevy of bonds to increase the public debt for purposes ranging from the ridiculous to the sublime. Question 2 on November's ballot, though, is the single opportunity we have this year to amend our state constitution. The language we will be asked to approve on November 8th is intended to fix the problem cited as the reason ex-Senate President Bill Irons got out from under the State Ethics Commission in 2009. To recap, the State Ethics Commission was created during the Constitutional Convention of 1984. It was intended to oversee and sanction the behavior of all state elected officials and all state workers to keep them from using their offices to promote or enrich themselves personally. The system worked just fine for 15 years until Mr. Irons argued that the speech of elected legislators during session of the House and Senate was protected to the point of excluding them from commission oversight. Some regarded that as absolutely tortured legal reasoning. Others felt that the fix was in. Whatever you think, sitting legislators got a get-out-of-jail-free card, courtesy of the Senate's first president. Now the language for 2 parts of the state's constitution, which is proposed by the referendum, will close that loophole. According to proponents, passage will bring the things back to what the '84 Constitutional Convention intended. As you will hear in our upcoming interview with John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause of Rhode Island, that good government group is pushing hard for passage of this fix. In fact, in the next few days, you may be hearing private polling results that strongly indicate the measure will be approved. Common Sense approves of this referendum initiative and will also approve of its passage. Citizens of the Ocean State have long suffered with the perception that the insiders live by different rules than the rest of us. Vote yes on question 2 to begin to turn that inequity around. April?
Good advice, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our analysis of top news stories around the Ocean State for this week. Before we begin the first segment of Mark's interview with John Marion of Common Cause, however, let's take time out for a common sense tradition. You don't know what that could be? Really? Are you kidding me? As reported by Steve Alquist of rifuture.org, as a board member of many companies RI has invested in, Treasurer Seth Magaziner has voted no on executive compensation plans. He claims that there is a misalignment between CEO pay and company performance, among other reasons. He backs up his sentiments by saying that his job is to deliver strong financial performance for the state's pension fund. So of course you know he's the expert whose advice we should be seeking. When it comes to pay versus performance, do you think that CEOs are the only professionals we should be scrutinizing? Are you kidding me? Magaziner said that when companies we invest in award excessive pay packages to executives, it comes at the expense of the pension fund and the public employees we serve. Hello? Have you seen the pension fund recently? Listen, I suggest that you pause this program, if you're watching it online or DVRing it, of course, and take a moment to review literally any other Common Sense episode. I'll pause for you. All right. So we're all caught up, right? Okay, good. Of course, we don't want to see the pension investment go toward paying some ridiculous bonus to a bazillionaire. But if we are going to pay those responsible for the pension based off of their performance, then Mr. Magaziner, you've got to get in line for your dose of scrutiny. I mean, you continue to get paid for your efforts, right? Your annual salary is well over $100,000, and whereas I am sure it is reflective of the great responsibility your office bears, you're doing squat for those who have paid into the pension. So I suggest you take your own advice and sacrifice your own cash up on the altar of public accountability. Anyone think that's going to happen? Are you kidding me?
I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense, the show that tries to make sense of the world we live in. And I'm pleased today to be in the offices of Common Cause with its executive director, John Marion. John, thank you very much for having us in.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mark.
Happy to do it. And Common Cause is by far the most well-known and highly thought of good government NGO that operates here in the Ocean State. And it has a long history and has done some great things, but of course is looking forward to doing greater things, and that's what we're here to talk to John about today. John, tell us a little bit about how Common Cause originated. Define it a little bit for some of our viewers that might not be as familiar.
Sure. So Common Cause was started back in 1970 by a man named John Gardner. Gardner was a former Republican congressman from Texas, had served in LBJ's cabinet, and resigned actually in protest to the Vietnam War. And in 1970 he said, having been a congressman, having run a foundation, having been a cabinet member, everyone in DC was organized. Corporations had PACs, labor unions had PACs, and lobbies. The only people who weren't organized were citizens. So he wanted to start an entity that was, he called it People's Lobby. And so he actually put ads in newspapers around the country, in all 50 states, and asked people to write him and say, I want to start a chapter of Common Cause in my state. About a dozen people in Rhode Island did. The probably best known was Lila Sapensley, a former, she's no longer with us, but a former state legislator and PUC commissioner. And he actually chose a woman named Natalie Jocelyn, who's still with us, still volunteers for Common Cause, gave her a dozen other names and said, go start a chapter. And they did that. In the 70s, we were all volunteer, worked very hard on early campaign finance and sunshine laws. And then in the 1980s, about the time of the Constitutional Convention we had, they started with full-time staff. And then in 1988, they hired a guy named Phil West. Phil was the executive director for 18 years, most well known for leading the fight on separation of powers, and then retired in 2006. I started in 2008, late 2008, as executive director and have been here ever since.
That's excellent. And so now, about how many Common Cause locations are there nationwide?
Yeah, so we have a headquarters in DC, and we have about 38 state chapters, roughly 20 of which have full-time staff. The other 18 or so are run by volunteers. We have a volunteer board here, but we have professional staff, 2 professional staff, myself and a woman named Mala Pongsavan, who run our Rhode Island chapter.
That's excellent. Now, nationwide, obviously here in Rhode Island, but also I assume it would be mirrored in other chapters. Give me an idea of the kind of ratio between your interest in local issues and national issues?
Yeah, so we have a national agenda. We have a national governing board that sets an agenda. We work on a lot of those issues. But Rhode Island being Rhode Island, there are unique issues to our state. I mentioned separation of powers. That was a 10-year fight for us. We're still doing cleanup work on that. And separation of powers was an issue you could only work on in Rhode Island because Rhode Island was the only state without it. And so we were the only chapter, for instance, that worked on separation of powers. We work on a mix. I don't know if it's 50-50. I don't know if it's 70-30. But we work on voting rights, election administration here, as does our national chapter. We work a lot on ethics here. The national entity doesn't work quite so much on ethics. That sort of thing. So it's a mix. Our state board sets a list of priorities every year of what they want us to work on, and that is usually sort of a mix of Rhode Island things along with national priorities.
Sounds like local concerns intrude and force themselves into your agenda and your priorities.
For sure. Separation of powers really does stand out. It was this truly unique issue that I think most Rhode Islanders didn't even understand back in the mid-90s, that we were the only state that didn't have this and hadn't had it for centuries.
How can the average Rhode Islander come to Common Cause and get something? What can get a report, get a white paper, get what do you send out?
So we're a membership organization. All our funding is from individual donors. We get a little bit of foundation support, have a very small endowment. And what you get for being a member is you get our newsletter. We try to send them out quarterly. We do a scorecard, a legislative scorecard every 2 years. But our research, we don't do a ton of research, but our research is open to the public. It's on our website, commoncauseri.org. And we post quite a bit on social media. We post quite a bit of information on that website about our issues. Every legislative session, particularly.
So it sounds like interested Rhode Islanders can come to the website, come to social media, and be plugged into Common Cause.
Yep, and then if you want to volunteer, you can sign up for our email alerts, or you can sign up to be a volunteer, and you can get more involved. So people come in the door, literally, and say, I want to get involved, and some of them, eventually join the board and get very involved. Others just volunteer. So, for instance, on Election Day in November, we'll send poll watchers out just to make sure everything's going well at the polls, and people volunteer to do that. So we'll have hopefully a couple dozen people doing that.
A minute ago you mentioned that ethics is kind of your highest priority right at the moment, and we all understand with the Irons decision that the Ethics Commission, which was founded to be a watchdog for all elected officials and operated quite happily that way until the Irons decision in 2009, if I recall, has now had this big hole put in it, mainly being elected legislators. Tell me a little bit more about what Common Cause is doing to try and rectify that situation.
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar, Rhode Island is unique in that it has one of the strongest ethics commissions in the country. It deals with all three branches of government. It was created from this constitutional convention in 1986. And in 2009, this Irons decision took some of their jurisdiction away over legislators. Not all of their jurisdiction, but the real key jurisdiction, which is policing conflicts of interest when it comes to legislating. So no longer can the Ethics Commission sanction anybody if they use their elected position as a legislator to financially benefit themselves or their business associates or their family.
So that's really a gaping hole in the authority that the Ethics Commission has, and obviously what's coming up is something to try and rectify that and to give our viewers a preview of coming attractions, because we're coming to the end of our first segment, but there is a referendum on November's ballot, is there not?
Yeah, so question number 2 on the ballot will be the fix to this problem. And we've been working for 7 years to get that fix in place.
Excellent, and we will talk a little bit more about that in the next segment. We'll look on to some of the things that you're looking forward to in the upcoming legislative session. We'll also talk about such hot issues as line item veto. So there's much more to come as we talk to John Marion here at the offices of Common Cause. And right now, we're going to take a break because I have reason to believe someone is about to ask the satiric question, are you kidding me? RI Future is a blog site for the progressive left here in the Ocean State. It is also a rich source of food for the satire we love to serve up. In fact, let me tell you just how rich a source of righteous indignation and solemn invective they are. RI Future is right up there with Robert Kando, the former executive director of the Rhode Island Board of Elections, when it comes to providing topics for this segment of Common Sense. Are you kidding me? In a September 12th blog post, Jonathan Jacobs was in full dudgeon over a mailer that the Gaspee Project had sent to voters in the Democratic primary in House District 34. The postcard highlighted some of the shortcomings of incumbent Rep. Teresa Tansey. These included reckless spending, needless regulation of businesses, and damaging confiscation of capital from the productive economy. On that last one, I'm talking to you, truck tolls. John Jacobs' problem seems to have been that he hasn't figured it out yet that no election is ever unanimous. But boy, was he wrapped around the axle about a perfectly obvious action made by Gaspee to support their 501c4 authority to take a stand on social issues. John incorrectly claimed that the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity was actually behind this slur on his candidate's good name. He even intoned the name of the great Satan, by his lights, the Republican Party. Oh no, John, not them. Actually, no, John, not them. You see, there is no GOP candidate in this race, so the primary is the big show. Perhaps his irritation was actually because he failed to take any action of this same sort against Democrat Ewa Dwurzinski, the other contestant on the ballot. Too late now, John. Just take it as a lesson learned about how the electoral process works. Then calm yourself and sit down and eat your cake. By the way, all that heat and light from RI Future was for naught. Turns out Tansey walked away with the primary after all. Are you kidding me? I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense, and we're here today in the offices of Common Cause, the NGO that's a good government agent here in Rhode Island. And we're talking with John Marion, the executive director. And John, just before the break, we were talking a little bit about the upcoming referendum, and I presume it's a referendum on a constitutional amendment to fix the ethics problem. Would you care to comment further?
Yeah, so it's the only constitutional amendment on the ballot. The first question will be the Tiverton Casino question. The remaining questions will all be the bond referenda. So this question 2 is going to be an opportunity for voters to reverse the Supreme Court's decision in 2009 that took away the legislature's full oversight over, the Ethics Commission, full oversight over legislators. And what it will do is it will change 2 parts of the Constitution that the Supreme Court in 2009 said were incompatible, and it will make them compatible with each other. The hope here is that this will settle this issue once and for all, and legislators, once this goes into effect next January, if it passes with more than 50% of the vote, will put the sort of cop back on the beat to make sure legislators are obeying our conflict of interest laws.
So the value argument to voters, the reason they should vote for this, in your opinion, is that it puts that cop back on the beat. Then the legislators can no longer be above or beyond the reach of the Ethics Commission and obviously have to act accordingly.
Yeah, and so, for instance, before 2009, before this was taken away, the Ethics Commission twice sanctioned legislators whose names I think we're all familiar with. In 2003, they sanctioned Gordon Fox for $10,000 for doing work on a bill to help GTEC build its corporate headquarters when he knew he was going to get legal work if that bill went through. And that's using his office to enrich himself.
Personal gain.
Personal gain. And in 2007, it sanctioned Ray Gallison to $6,000 for not disclosing certain income based on a complaint from Patricia Morgan that he had used his office for personal gain. And so right now, the Ethics Commission couldn't sanction somebody the way it did Gordon Fox. So we think the value of the Ethics Commission is that it's not going to throw these people out of office. That took the U.S. Attorney getting involved. But it is going to signal to voters and citizens that there are problems, that people aren't staying within the lines of ethical conflict.
So it sounds like this is something that people really ought to seriously consider. You've sold me. I'm
Yep.
going to vote for it. The question is, how are you going to communicate that value argument to the rest of the electorate? How are you going to get that word out?
Yeah, so we're doing it in a couple of different ways. One, I'm going to meet before any group that'll have me. So neighborhood associations, Rotary clubs. I think I had 6 speaking engagements last week alone. So we're going to try to reach a lot of people person to person. We're going to be tabling farmers markets throughout the state. As you know, there are many farmers markets. And we'll be doing a larger social media campaign. We'll be launching a website. All that's going to launch in the next couple of weeks as voters get past the primary, get past Labor Day, and start paying attention to this election. So we'll have a pretty robust campaign, including maybe some robocalls, including some canvassing and door knocking.
So it sounds to me like viewers of Common Sense TV can go to the Common Cause website and look up the contact page and get your phone number and probably get John Marion to come down and talk to your group.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to come. We've been going to Woonsocket to Westerly to talk about this, and so we'll go any place in the state and talk to any group.
Excellent. Assuming the amendment passes, what further procedural obstacles are there before it actually takes effect? What has to happen next?
So it actually, nothing has to happen. So as long as 50% plus 1 of the voters approve it this November 8th, it goes into effect next January, I believe January 6th. And so it won't cost anything. The Ethics Commission will just begin hearing complaints against legislators once again.
But the 6th of January is the important date then, so it doesn't happen the minute that the Secretary of State certifies the results.
No.
It is
So constitutional
probably,
amendments don't take effect until the next year.
Okay.
So,
Good.
but there's not, like I said, there's no fiscal impact. It will just happen, and we'll return to the way we were before June of 2009.
Now, one of the things that Common Cause does most effectively, of course, is lobbying. Do you see your organization being an agent for raising and forwarding ethics complaints?
So traditionally, we haven't filed a lot of ethics complaints. Operation Clean Government, which is, I would say, the other notable good government group besides the League of Women Voters in the state, often filed complaints. So they filed a complaint against Senator Irons that resulted in the court case. And they have been less vigorous in doing that. We've stepped up. I think I filed 1 complaint. And we've looked at whether or not we should be more active in that. It was always nice for us to be the policy group and OCG to be the complaint group. With their not filing as many complaints, we have to make a decision as an organization whether we're going to do that.
But unless I'm mistaken, individual voters could also be the complaint group
yeah,
if they chose.
Ideally, this is a mechanism for citizens who believe that legislators or any public official, including public employees who have used their office for personal gain, this is an outlet for them to do something, so they can file an ethics complaint. It's open to anyone who wants to do that.
Excellent. So an informed and excited citizenry could do all of that for you, which would leave Common Cause looking for more to do.
Yeah.
So I presume you have some
Segue.
plans for the upcoming legislative session, which of course takes place after this is resolved.
Yeah, so we're here in September, but we're already thinking about January and what we're going to work on. And we've been working on this ethics issue for 7 years, and there's been some pent-up demand to work on other things. Notably, we're looking very far forward at 2020 and the fact that we'll be redistricting again after that next census. And the time to work on redistricting is now, not when it actually is happening, because when it actually happens, the deals are done. and the citizens get the short end of the stick. So now is the time to reform the system. And so we'll be looking at a constitutional amendment to have a citizens commission, a public commission, do that redistricting, take the district boundaries out of the hands of the people who benefit from them, the elected officials, and put it into the hands of the voters.
The majority party in most cases.
Well, so ideally, a citizens redistricting commission would be as nonpartisan as we could get it. We see in California, in other places that have had these types of citizens commissions, that they haven't favored parties.
Mm-hmm. And you would think in this day and age of computer science, you could easily make the required number of districts with each having as close to the required number of voters as could be specified, and be as contiguous as possible, so we don't have these meandering, gerrymandered districts that we have today. If you in fact can code that into law, either as an amendment or even just as a general law, far enough in advance of when people's individual futures come into play, the legislators, do you think that you can get something like that to stick?
Yeah, so it's tricky. It's not easy at all, especially in a state that doesn't have initiative or referenda. So citizens can't put this on the ballot. They have to go through the legislature, much like the ethics issue. Who has the greatest self-interest in the outcome? The legislature. So it's not going to be easy.
Well, nothing is ever easy, but after 10 years on separation of powers and 7 years on this, you've proved you can do it. Right now, let's take a break. There will be another segment of Are You Kidding Me? And we'll be back with John Marion.
The primaries are over. Casualties abound in the current legislature, and the people of Rhode Island can hopefully look forward to some big changes in their representation. So that definitely means that we don't have anything to worry about in the general election, right? Are you kidding me? Do you think you only vote for representatives? Guess what you're not thinking about? Bonds. That's a super important part of the upcoming general election, because in total there will be $227.5 million of new debt for Rhode Islanders to vote on, and that is not including the tens of millions more that municipalities are probably seeking. I want you to ask yourself something. Have you ever really researched the questions on your ballot? When you or I ask for millions of dollars to expand, quote, innovation campuses, unquote, do you really know what that means? Do you really understand where the money goes? I mean, because I definitely don't. I'd like to know where the breakdown of these figures are located so I can educate myself. I need more than a couple of sentences to explain why I should vote for new debt. I mean, look at the cumulative number of $227.5 million. Do you think that's going to be how the money is listed on your ballot? Of course not. It'll be broken down for each line asking for cash. And you and I aren't bringing calculators to the voting booth, so maybe the powers that be are hoping that we don't look at the bigger picture. I have another question, and it is one that I'm stealing from Justin Katz of the Ocean State Current. If different groups within the state need this money so badly, why didn't they budget for it in the first place? Maybe if Rick needs a brand new building, it doesn't make sense to budget for it in your yearly projections, but then again, if I want to add an addition to my house, I have to plan for it for a while. I don't get to ask voters whether or not I can have their cash to fix my stuff. Shouldn't the government be planning better? Are you kidding me?
I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense. Thank you for tuning in and for coming back to this interesting discussion we're having with John Marion, the Executive Director of Common Cause. We have talked a little bit about the upcoming referendum on ethics, talk about some of the things you will mean to do in the next legislative session. There's one other issue I'd like to bring up now. It's sort of bridges between these two, and that is the line item veto. I assume that the line item veto is something that Common Cause is greatly in favor of.
Yeah, so my board voted, I think 2 years ago, to support the effort to give the governor the line item veto, and we've testified in favor of it in the last legislative session.
Conceptually, everyone understands that most states allow a governor to pick one line or more or one section of a budget and to veto that without having to veto the entire document, which, as a practical matter, in the case of a state budget, you can't veto the whole thing to get one piece of it out. So that would require legislative override if it were forthcoming. on an issue-by-issue basis, so they couldn't hide anything. Great idea, but how do we implement the line item veto? Should it be a legislative initiative? Is there a law that implements line item veto? Or do you think that ultimately the route to the constitutional convention, constitutional amendment, is the best?
Yeah, so I think it needs to be a constitutional amendment. I'm not a lawyer, but if you're going to make a change in the balance of power between the branches of government, that needs to be done in our Constitution. One of the problems I saw in the last legislative session is that the current proposals for line item veto that were out there hadn't been fully vetted and really thought out by advocates, including ourselves. So one of the things we've been spending the off-season, so to speak, doing is educating ourselves a little bit on what the variety of line item veto that are out there look like. So there are 44 states that have this. Not all states do it the same. Not all have the same override threshold. Not all define a line item the same way. And we want to make sure we have it right. So when we're advocating for something, it's a solution that can be implemented right away. Our take, we're not a fiscal group, we're not a tax watchdog. Our take is that this is a way to take what is the strongest legislature still in the country, and the weakest governor, and balance things a little bit better. And give the governor a chance to highlight issues that are shoved into the budget, often aren't germane really to the budget, but are policy decisions that are being made, but put in the budget for political reasons, and highlight them, and separate them, and force the legislature to address those issues on their own merits.
So if I have this correct, the next time that the voters could pass on this in a referendum would be 2018.
Exactly.
And in that time in between, you're going to try and tailor a line item veto proposal to the needs of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Using as a template the various, you say there's 44 others out there now?
Yeah, so we want to make sure
45th one will be ours.
Yeah, and make sure it reflects the way we do our budget here. Every state does a budget differently. People would be surprised to know, there are some states that pass 2-year budgets, and so we need to make sure that we have the right line item veto for Rhode Island.
Sounds like you also have a publicity drive ahead of you that may take up most of the remaining 2 years before you can get it to the ballot.
Yeah, and Ken Block, who we all know, has been a big champion of this. He's been, I'd say, in the lead on the publicity end, and is very good at generating that publicity. So we're working with him on some of the details because we like to be the policy group, make sure we have that right. And he'll probably be the lead on the publicity.
So we can expect a robust push from Common Cause and a number of its allies, perhaps even in the legislature, to get a line item veto perhaps on the ballot for 18.
Yeah,
that's great. Meanwhile, speaking of the ballot, this year, here in Rhode Island, we have a brand new hardware and software system that's being used to record and tabulate our votes. We have just had a kind of a test drive at a primary election that had a very light turnout. Can we talk a little bit about the new system? Is it an improvement over the old system, where it is, and of course, the all-important question of cybersecurity is on everyone's mind these days, so can we talk a little bit about that? What do you think about this new system, John?
Yeah, so in full disclosure, I was on a working group or task force that the Secretary of State put together to make recommendations on the purchase of new equipment. And so I've been supportive of this process all along. Rhode Island was ahead of the curve. So in 1996, we purchased new voting machines. We went from the Shoup lever machines, mechanical machines, to electronic ballot scanners. We were ahead of the curve, but after the 2000 election, a lot of money was pumped into voting equipment by the federal government, and so the life cycle of these machines sped up really quickly, and so we very quickly got our machines became old, and they became difficult to service, difficult to find parts for, and get a service contract for. And so we needed new machines desperately. And the Secretary of State stepped up when the Board of Elections wouldn't and grabbed that authority and purchased these new machines. They're actually really the newest model of the machines we've been using for 20 years. So they're produced by a company called ES&S, and it's the DS200. So it works roughly the same way, right? You're still voting on paper, which is something we want, because if all else goes wrong electronically, you want a paper record. That is the greatest lesson we know. But they have some nice new features. They have a touch screen, so if you overvote or undervote, instead of having a poll worker look at your ballot and tell you that, the touch screen is going to tell you that, and you can override it or you can fix it. And so it has some nice new features. One of the features, though, is that it transmits the results wirelessly to the Board of Elections at the end of the evening. And that is the one area where there would be a little bit of concern with the cybersecurity, because that is a point of entry into the system from the internet. There are layers of security provided by the vendor for that. But really, like I said, the ultimate layer of security is that you have paper. So if all else goes wrong, if there is some sort of attack, the machine can't alter the paper ballots. You still have the paper ballots.
Seems like you're a subject matter expert on this, John. Let me ask a quick question. You say that at the end of the night, when you close the polling place, the machine does a wireless transmission to the Board of Elections. In days gone by, what we've done is taken a physical device out of the recorder, essentially the disk drive, for lack of a better term, brought it to the Board of Canvassers, and then it was uploaded to the state by telephone.
Yep.
And so this is actually going to be like a cell phone call made by the voting machine itself.
Yeah. So
at the polling place.
Yes, but they also still have the physical media. So they were cartridges in the old machines, and the new machines, they're thumb drive. They still have the physical media that will be uploaded the same way you described, as well as 5 copies of paper tape. So there are actually, in essence, 3 ways in which those results are going to be transmitted.
So then if there is any question, they can all be compared to make sure that everything's copacetic.
Yep, and then even if some manipulation occurs, it'd be difficult to imagine, but if some manipulation occurs to change all 3, then still you have the paper ballots, and that's most important. What we're going to emphasize in the next legislative session, though, is those paper ballots should be audited. We don't compare, unlike more than 50% of the states, we don't take a sample of those ballots and compare them to what the machine says.
Just to verify.
Yes.
Okay, well, with that said, let's leave that at this point. We have one more segment coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned, because we will be finishing up with John Marion right after another Are You Kidding Me segment. Last week, Rhode Island held its primary election. Of the state's 754,222 registered voters, just a tiny fraction actually came out to vote. Only a few contests had primary races to determine the nominee for the general election in the first place. But the real problem is that once again, the Ocean State sits dead last on a list of national rankings by state. Now that Hawaii has seen the light, we have the very last primary election in America. So who cares, you ask? Are you kidding me? Says I. Primary elections naturally fray unity within a party, as fellow partisan fights fellow partisan for the chance to be standard bearer. The sooner that question can be settled, the sooner the healing process can begin, so all is well within party ranks by November. In federal elections, those for U.S. House and Senate, there is a bigger problem. National donors won't contribute to a campaign that might be cut off at its knees by a primary loss. But by mid-September, when Little Rhody makes its decision, all that national money has already been handed out. That kills a challenger's chance at real financing, which brings up the real reason our primary is held so late. It helps incumbents to do it that way. If Rhode Island held its primary in June, as Connecticut does, then declarations would have to be made in March, as Connecticut's are. In that scenario, a sitting legislator who voluntarily retired, or one who drew a tough primary challenger, would immediately be regarded as a lame duck. That member's power ratio in the chamber he or she served would plummet. No elected official wants to make themselves invisible while there's still horse trading to be done on the floor. And therein lies the rub. The selfishness of office sacrifices the idea of an even playing field in order to make life easier for the incumbent and to protect them from the rigors of a real race. Hey, who do you think votes on all this stuff in the legislature? Incumbents. So this gross shortcoming in the Rhode Island electoral calendar will probably not be corrected until we wise up and hold a constitutional convention. And even then, as they did in 2012, the forces of status quo will fight us tooth and nail. Are you kidding me? I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense TV. We're here with Common Cause Executive Director John Marion. John, thanks for putting up with us for all of these segments. This is a very in-depth interview and something you'll probably find nowhere else on cable or TV. As we come to the end of the line, and you've talked about a number of the things that Common Cause is involved with on behalf of the voters, assuming that everything you have talked about to this date falls into place and you are once again victorious, what's next? Looking ahead, what is Common Cause going to do?
Yeah, we'll never go out of business because we're in Rhode Island. So the journalists call it a playground for journalists because we have so many interesting situations come up, particularly in terms of political corruption. There are endless numbers of things we can work on. Once we have the jurisdiction, knock wood, of the Ethics Commission back over the General Assembly, there are certainly parts of our state ethics laws that need to be improved. There are parts of the revolving door that need to be tightened. For instance, there have been a number of controversial cases around the revolving door in the last couple of years. So there are a lot of things, there's a lot of fertile ground for us to farm here in terms of that. One of the things we were talking about in the break was the election calendar, right? So our Secretary of State has talked a little bit about one of what would be a really, significant change, which would be moving the primary. The primary, we're taping this on a Wednesday, the primary was yesterday, September 13th. That's the latest primary in the United States. And if you back out from that primary, we have a filing period for office in July, late June, early July, and so forth. And a lot could change in the way we elect our elected representatives if we changed our primary date. And that's something I think we want to look at. But we don't want to just think about, okay, what if we had it in June or what if we had it in April? But what does that mean for the other issues we care about? Does that make it more expensive to run for office and more difficult for people? Does it make it cheaper? Does that advantage incumbents? Does that favor challengers? What does it mean if we're going to change these? Because once you change one thing in a dynamic system, you're changing the whole system. But it's something we want to look at because I think a lot of people feel like the system is rigged for incumbents of either party in the way we elect people in the state. And we don't want a rigged system for incumbents. We want a system that's fair. And we want people, voters, whether it's through redistricting or access to the ballot or whatnot, voters to feel like they can make change if they want to have change.
And give them the time to do that. I'll give you a couple of quick things that an earlier primary would do that is not directly related to incumbency. They would allow parties to come back together and make friends again after two halves of them had gone at one another. Mm-hmm. And they would also allow, and especially in the federal races, national money to be committed. Right now, today, if somebody won a primary yesterday for the Congress or the Senate, and then said, "Okay, I'm now the nominee of my party. I can go out and get nationwide donations." I'm sorry, at this late date, they're all committed. I know, I was there, and so it really does hamstring anybody who has a primary because of how late it is.
And so it shows you that, like I said, it's a dynamic system. A lot of parts change if you just change this one thing, which is the date. But it could be a catalyst for better things. And so, but we need to look at that. I think we need to really have a conversation. We need to hear from a lot of the different stakeholders, so to speak, about what would change, and think about the campaign finance law and and the other parts of the election calendar and how it interacts with them.
Sounds like your typical approach is to identify a problem, do some study so that you think you have a fair handle on all aspects of it, and then try and tailor some sort of a proposed solution to the actual landscape of Rhode Island.
Yeah, and like we talked about at the beginning, Rhode Island's a unique beast, and we want to make sure that our solutions aren't just taken from a box and applied to Rhode Island. I think that's always a bad solution. To just say, let's do what they do over there. Let's take that model bill and just do it here. Because things are a little different here. And we want to take advantage of the good things, the advantages we have, the small size, the fact that we have this commuting legislature. You can get from any part of the state and serve in the state legislature. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That opens it to a lot of people. Rather than other models. So we want to take advantage of that, but it requires that extra study. It requires you going the extra mile to make sure you get it right.
Well, so you'll be looking at things like revisions in the ethics law as they relate to probably transparency, probably the autonomy that different either legislators or because the law does apply to state workers as well, to the various bureaucracies that are involved there, and basically standing the watch to see how it's all going.
Yeah, and that's the other part is focusing on implementation. So it's no good to pass laws and then not have them properly implemented. And we've seen some success in that, and we've seen some failures in that. So separation of powers. Implementation was very good at the very beginning. Now it's trailed off. And so you still see legislators introduce bills that are a violation of our new constitutional order, and we have to be the watchdog. There were 60 groups at the height of the separation of powers movement working on that issue. There's one group left now, and that's us. And we need to do that on more issues we work on.
Excellent. So are you able, in your opinion, to get the kind of gravitational influence in the public discourse, the media attention, the loud enough voice to get people to hear when you notice problems like this and start speaking on them?
Yeah, we're fortunate in being really the only good government group with a full-time staff that we can get a lot of attention when we want to and dig into things. The unfortunate side is there's less media, so the Providence Journal is shrinking. And they have often been our megaphone on these issues. When we see something, we raise it with them and bring it into the public eye. And with their shrinking, it becomes more difficult for us.
John, we've just got about a minute and a half left, and you've been great to give us this much time, but perhaps you could leave our viewers with your impression of how you want them to see Common Cause when they look at you.
Sure. So what we want people to know is that we're an organization open to them, right? We're the people's lobby and they're the people. So if they want to get involved with us, like I said earlier, they should join our mailing list, but then give us a call, write us an email, let us know how you want to get involved. We have lobby days where we take people up to the assembly. We have them talk to their legislators about our agenda. And that leaves a deep impression. So there are a lot of ways to get involved, and we want people to know, get involved with us in some way. Follow us on Twitter, or join our Facebook page, like our Facebook page. You can do something. Rhode Island, like I said, because we're so small, it has its challenges, but it has its strengths. And one of the strengths is people can very easily get involved here, and we're one vessel through which they can do that.
Sounds like you have the option for people to come in and stick a toe in the water to find out and to advance into the organization as far and as fast as they feel comfortable doing it.
Exactly.
And obviously, the more the merrier. John, you've been great to take time with us today. Obviously, Common Cause is a super organization nationwide, and you're the keeper of that flame here in Rhode Island. We thank you for everything you do, and I'm sure that all of the viewers of Common Sense TV thank you for it as well.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Seems the American death rate has taken a turn in the wrong direction. For the last decade, the rate declined thanks in part to better medical technology and disease management. Not anymore. In 2015, the death rate jumped to nearly 730 deaths per 100,000 Americans. That was up from the 723 per 100,000 Americans in 2014. So while we have been doing better with cancer and heart disease, we have gone the other way with drug overdoses, accidental injuries, suicides, Alzheimer's disease, hypertension, and strokes. Now, here are some numbers. Drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States. There were 47,055 drug overdoses in 2014. Prescription pain relievers accounted for 18,893 of these, and 19,574 were caused by heroin. Seems our docs write 259 million prescriptions in 2012 for opioids. Okay, but we know that 4 or 5 new heroin users started out misusing prescription painkillers. What are the names of these drugs? You can be given a script for oxycodone, for hypercodone, Vicodin, codeine, morphine, fentanyl, and as well as a few other less known. What do these drugs do to you? The opioids interact with your opioid receptors on nerve cells in the brain and the nervous system to produce pleasurable effects and relieve pain. But for some of us, it can be addictive. The prescription rate for opioids amongst adolescents and young adults nearly doubled from 1994 to 2007. And lots of these folks share their unused pills or get them free from friends or relatives. In addition to the possibilities of addiction, abuse, and overdosing, the use of prescription opioids can have a number of side effects you may not be aware of. Tolerance may develop so that you take more medication for the same relief. Physical dependence, meaning you have symptoms of withdrawal when you stop taking the meds. You can have increased sensitivity to pain, constipation, nausea, vomiting, and dry mouth. You can get sleepy or dizzy, confused, depressed, lose testosterone, get itchy or sweaty. Now, doesn't that all sound great? Back into the stats. Between 1999 and 2014, more than 165,000 people died in the United States from overdosing with opioids. The overdose rates were highest among people aged 25 to 54 years. The rates were higher among non-Hispanic whites and American Indian or Alaskan natives. Men were more likely to die from overdosing, but the mortality gap between men and women is closing. Seems women are more likely to have chronic pain, be prescribed pain relievers, be given higher doses, and use them for longer time periods than the guys. Between 1999 and 2010, 48,000 women died from overdosing. That was a 400% increase compared to the 237% increase for the men. Heroin overdose deaths amongst women have tripled in the last few years. They are now up to 1.2 per 100,000 people. Now here's a scary one. Every day, over 1,000 people are treated in emergency departments for misusing prescription opioids. All this is costing the system billions of dollars that could easily be put to a better use. Doing the research for this subject, I found an internet site called Real Time. Now that site listed the various ways Americans die. The numbers were from January 1st of this year to today. There were 35 specific categories of how to die. Example, heart disease accounted for 437,706 of us. Medical errors, 179,000 and change. Kidney failure, 30,467. Homicides, 11,969. Drunk driving, 24,000 and change. Drowning, 2,700. Murder by gun, 8,188 people. Texting while driving, 4,267 of us. All the drug abuse accounted for 17,815 deaths. And then the prescription drug overdose of 10,687 people. The article did list some of the more infrequent ways to die, like being killed by a falling tree. 106 of us did that. 58 of us were struck by lightning. 426 fell out of bed. And then there is a new category that is now being counted. This is rich. Pokemon Go. 2 people dead. Thank you for watching, and God bless.